In the summer of 1969, Los Angeles was shaken by a string of brutal murders that would shock the world. At the center of it was Charles Manson, a manipulative drifter who built a cult-like following he called the Manson family. Living on the edge of society at a ranch outside L.A., Manson preached twisted beliefs about race, the end of the world, and a coming war he called Helter Skelter, inspired by a Beatles song. His followers, mostly young, lost, and vulnerable, saw him as a prophet and would do anything he ordered. On the nights of August 8th and 9th, Manson sent his followers into wealthy neighborhoods of Los Angeles to kill. At one house, actress Sharon Tate, who was 8 months pregnant, was murdered along with 4 others. The next night, supermarket executive Leno LaBianca and his wife Rosemary were slain in their home. The sheer violence, the random selection of victims, and the bizarre messages written in blood terrified the city. When Manson and his followers were finally arrested, the world saw how far manipulation and blind devotion could go. The trial exposed his control over the family and the chilling ideology behind the murders. Even decades later, the Manson murders remain one of America's most infamous crimes, a horrifying example of how fear, cult mentality, and charisma can lead to tragedy. Los Angeles in the late 1960s was a city of dreams. Young actors, musicians, and drifters poured into California chasing fame, freedom, and a new way of life. The world was changing fast. Peace protests filled the streets. The counterculture movement was alive, and music carried messages of revolution. But in the shadows of all that freedom was a man who would twist those ideals into something terrifying. His name was Charles Manson. Manson was not a rock star, though he wanted to be. He wasn't a prophet, though he claimed to be. He was a manipulator, a small man with a hypnotic voice and a piercing stare who could convince people that his words carried power. He had spent years in and out of prison, learning how to control and read others. By the late 1960s, he gathered a group of mostly young women and a few men who were searching for belonging. He called them his family. The family lived on the fringes of society, first in San Francisco, then drifting into Los Angeles, where they eventually settled on an abandoned movie ranch. There, Manson preached his twisted beliefs. He spoke about race wars, the end of the world, and a prophecy he named Helter Skelter, inspired by a Beatles song he believed carried secret messages. To outsiders, it sounded like nonsense, but to his followers, vulnerable, searching, and already under a spell, it sounded like truth. They gave up their families, their freedom, and their identities to follow him. They wore their hair long, lived communally, and did whatever Manson ordered. To them, he wasn't just a man, he was a leader, a messiah. Slowly, he gained total control. But control was not enough for Manson. He wanted chaos. He wanted to prove his prophecies right. And so, in the summer of 1969, he began planning something that would shock the world. His family members, brainwashed and loyal, would carry out acts of murder. Not for revenge, not for money, but to spread fear and confusion across Los Angeles. On the evening of August 8, 1969, Manson told his followers to drive into the Hollywood Hills. He handed out instructions. He gave them weapons. He ordered them to kill everyone inside a house on Cielo Drive. Inside that home was actress Sharon Tate, 8 months pregnant, along with her friends. None of them knew what was coming. The family members climbed into their car and drove into the night. The city was calm, the stars bright, and the streets still. But in just a few hours, Los Angeles would wake to one of the most shocking crime scenes in American history. It was just past midnight on August 9th, 1969, when a car carrying members of the Manson family pulled up to 1050 Cielo Drive. The house belonged to music producer Terry Melcher once, a man who had rejected Charles Manson's dream of becoming a star. But now it was rented by actress Sharon Tate and her husband, director Roman Polanski. Sharon, 8 months pregnant, was at home that night with friends, Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, and Wojciech Frykowski. None of them had ever met Charles Manson, but that didn't matter. Manson had chosen this house. Manson himself did not go inside. Instead, he sent 4 of his loyal followers, Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian. They were under strict orders. Kill everyone. No mercy. No survivors. As they climbed the steep driveway, Linda hesitated. She stayed outside, a lookout, while the others pushed forward. What happened next shocked Los Angeles. Gunshots echoed through the night. Screams shattered the silence of the hills. Inside the house, terror unfolded. Sharon Tate begged for the life of her unborn child. Her friends fought desperately, but they were no match for the attackers. When it was over, 5 people lay dead, including Sharon Tate. Their lives had been ended with cold, brutal obedience to Manson's command. The killers didn't stop there. To make sure the message was clear, they scrawled words on the walls in blood. Strange phrases meant to spark fear and chaos. It wasn't just murder. It was theater. It was terror. And it was meant to send a message that Charles Manson's vision of Helter Skelter had begun. By morning, news of the murders raced across Los Angeles. Reporters gathered outside the gates of Cielo Drive. Police tried to piece together what had happened, but the scene was almost too bizarre to understand. The brutality, the writing on the walls, the randomness of the victims. It felt like something out of a nightmare. The city panicked. If a pregnant actress and her friends could be slaughtered in their own home, who was safe? Hollywood celebrities hired bodyguards. Ordinary families double-locked their doors. Fear spread like wildfire. People whisper about cults, about demons, about unknown forces stalking the city at night. But Charles Manson wasn't done. He wanted more. He wanted the chaos to spread further, to prove that his prophecy of a coming war was real. The very next night, on August 10th, he chose another target. This time, he wanted to show his family how to kill with even greater cruelty. He led them to the home of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca, a well-off couple living quietly in Los Feliz, not far from Hollywood. Unlike the first attack, Manson himself entered the home. He spoke calmly to the couple, tying them up before leaving the actual killing to his followers. He wanted them to learn. He wanted them to obey. And as his family carried out his orders, he walked away, leaving behind another scene of horror. The LaBianca murders sent the city into full-blown terror. 2 nights, 2 crime scenes, 7 victims. Police were overwhelmed. Were these killings connected? Was it the work of a cult? Or random acts of madness? Nobody knew. Behind it all was a man who hadn't lifted the knife or fired a gun, yet whose influence was stronger than any weapon. Charles Manson sat back, hidden at his ranch, watching Los Angeles unravel. To his followers, he wasn't just a man anymore. He was a prophet, a leader bringing his dark vision to life. But the trail of fear he created couldn't stay hidden forever. Investigators were closing in. Witnesses would talk. Suspicions would rise. And soon, the ranch where the family lived would no longer feel so safe. The summer of 1969 had become a nightmare for Los Angeles, but the story was only beginning. The police were about to discover that these murders were no random act. They were part of a plan controlled by a man who thrived on fear and manipulation. And in the months that followed, the world would finally see Charles Manson for what he truly was. The city of Los Angeles was frozen in fear. 2 nights, 7 victims. Strange messages scrawled in blood. Nothing made sense. Detectives worked around the clock, but the killing seemed random, disconnected, impossible to solve. The pressure was mounting. Newspapers demanded answers. Citizens demanded protection. Celebrities hired guards and bought guns. It felt like no one was safe. At Spawn Ranch, Charles Manson's family carried on as though nothing had happened. They rode horses, played music, and lived in a haze of devotion to their leader. To them, the murders were not crimes. They were part of Manson's prophecy. But outside the ranch, the law was closing in. The first real break came not from the bloody crime scenes, but from a family member's loose tongue. Susan Atkins, one of Manson's most loyal followers, had been arrested on an unrelated charge. While in jail, she bragged to her cellmates about the killings, describing Sharon Tate's last moments in chilling detail. The confession spread quickly through the prison system until it reached investigators. At last, the police had a lead. Soon, warrants were issued. Detectives and sheriffs swarmed Spawn Ranch. Manson was arrested along with several of his followers. At first, he was calm, even smiling as he was led away. But once in court, his true power was revealed, not through evidence, but through the hypnotic loyalty of his family. During the trial, prosecutors laid out the shocking truth. Charles Manson had not physically killed the victims himself. Instead, he had manipulated and commanded his family to do it for him. He preached about Helter Skelter, a coming race war he believed would destroy society. In his twisted vision, the murders would spark chaos between communities, and when the dust settled, Manson and his family would rise as leaders of a new world. The defense tried to argue that Manson wasn't responsible, that he hadn't wielded a knife or pulled the trigger. But the prosecution countered with simple, haunting fact. His words were weapons. His control over his followers was so complete that they killed without question. In the eyes of the law, that made him as guilty as the ones who committed the murders. The trial itself became a spectacle. Manson carved an X into his forehead, later turning it into a swastika to show his rejection of the system. His followers stood outside the courthouse, chanting and singing in his support, their loyalty unbroken. Inside, testimony revealed the depths of his control. One by one, family members described how they believed Manson was more than human, a prophet with the power to decide who lived and who died. When the verdict was finally read in 1971, the courtroom held its breath. Charles Manson and several of his followers were found guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. They were sentenced to death, though California later overturned the death penalty, reducing their sentences to life in prison. For many, justice had been served, but the scars remained. The randomness of the crimes, the innocence of the victims, and the eerie devotion of the family left a wound that time could not easily heal. Sharon Tate's death in particular became a symbol of lost innocence in Hollywood. A reminder that fame and fortune could not shield anyone from the darkness that lurked in the world. Charles Manson spent the rest of his life behind bars, but his name never faded. Books, documentaries, and films kept the story alive. The image of the wild-eyed cult leader who convinced others to kill became a permanent part of American crime history. Even in prison, he continued to speak to reporters, spouting the same twisted ideas, never admitting guilt, never showing remorse. For decades, the Manson murders remained more than just a crime. They became a cultural marker. They represented the end of the 1960s dream, the dark side of the counterculture, and the terrifying power of manipulation. People asked how such ordinary young men and women could be convinced to commit such horrific acts. The answer was chilling. Under Manson's control, they believed they had no choice. Charles Manson died in prison in 2017, but the shadow of his crime still lingers. The words Helter Skelter, once a song title, now carry a darker meaning. The ranch where the family once lived has long since decayed, but its story still haunts Los Angeles. The Manson murders showed the world how charisma, fear, and blind devotion could be twisted into tools of destruction. And while time has passed, the echo of those nights in 1969 continues to remind us a hard truth. Evil can wear many faces, and sometimes it hides in plain sight.